Okay, well, this is not the Shrinking Violet panel, but I thought I would take the opportunity to do a couple things. Keela and I were kind of joking about this is where the rubber hits the road panel, because we actually have to come up with some concrete actions here. But before we do that, I thought I'd ask Minister Sandals just to give us a brief update on the vision that was released yesterday, because I know it's been referred to a couple times. But no more than 2 minutes, if you can do a vision in 2 minutes.
So, I'm one of those fortunate people who has people who hand me hard copies. For those of you who don't have hard copies, it's on the Ministry of Education website. We spent a lot of time talking to people all over the province, and we heard a lot of things. We heard people talking about needing to broaden the definition of success in a couple of different ways. One was, I think, the sort of area that Michael Fullen and others were talking to you about this morning, thinking about those skills that you need, the critical thinking, the communications, the creativity, those skills. So that needs to be part of success. We also need to think, though, about student well-being, because sometimes we get so focused on academic achievement that we sometimes lose sight of things like mental health and bullying and some of those issues. So we need to make sure that that's a part of what we're doing. We need to think about technology and how do we use technology well. And we need to keep working on public confidence in public education. So just to the way we have captured that, if you have a chance to get a look at it, this is, I've got something called the Minister's Student Advisory Council, and this is something that they did when I asked them last summer what they wanted the system to look like. And if you get a chance to pull this down, it's really incredible to have a look at the things the students said. But the way we have captured this just broadly is achieving excellence, and I just told you we need to broaden what we mean by excellence. Part of that is experiential learning. The kids are really interested in wanting to understand how curriculum is relevant and how it relates to the real world. Making sure we think about equity, and that when we're talking about equity, we have to recognize that not all kids come to us with the same background, with the same opportunity. But what we have learned over the years is that when we focus on a group of students who are struggling, we can actually help. And two of the groups we know that we want to focus on right now are our Aboriginal students who are lagging behind others. And a group that we don't think about a lot, which is kids who are in care, i.e. our Crown wards. So the kids who are in foster care, who are wards of the state, they come from, by definition, really difficult backgrounds that interfere with education. So how can we support them? But then, as I said, we need to think about the well-being of the whole student, and we need to think about building good citizens, and we need to think about this whole issue of how do we communicate the good news about the successes of public education in Ontario to the broader public, so that the broader public knows what we're doing.
Okay,
so
thank
that's
you.
the short version.
Thank you. Rick, I read your paper, People Without Jobs, Jobs Without People. You just heard a new vision for the system. What's your assessment of how we're doing, and what recommendations would you have to improve it?
Well, I admittedly am more on the post-secondary side than I am on the K-12 side, so take my comments that way. A couple of recommendations I would make is we probably have the worst labor market information system in any developed country in the world, bar none. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's happening. But the consequence is, even when parents and children want to make better decisions with relations to education and employment, the data is just not there for them. The current data we use, most of it is federal. The provinces tried to play with a little bit, is based on the 2006 census. It was last updated in 2011. It was, in that update, it was based on the household survey that got a 68% response rate compared to a 93% response rate from the survey, mandatory long-form census survey. So you have huge problems with the data. And I guess my last comment is there, I was fortunate in 2009 to be on a panel with Don Drummond, and we were asked by the federal and provincial labor market ministers to recommend changes to the LMI system. We recommended 68, 4 have been implemented.
Okay, James, you have kids in school, so you hear it from your kids, and you also see it from the employer's side. If you could make some recommendations on how we could work together better between the private sector and the educational sector, what would you recommend?
There's a lot of answers to that one, but I think the first thing is the message to the private sector: get involved. I think there's no simpler message than to say get involved. Don't sit and wait for somebody to invite you. Put up your hand and say I want to help. I want to help out, and don't have some resilience. Like the student said, don't quit early. Keep pushing. I think that's one. I think that's a key area to make sure that business pushes to be involved as much as they can. Again, business is not in the business of education, but we are most definitely in the business of receiving and benefiting from the education system. So we're willing recipients of the results, but we want to help however we can to make sure that those results produce the best.
And Sheryl, you're running a school, so what, in your view, is the best way for the private sector to be received? Because I have heard people say, especially teachers, oh my God, we got this person in and they didn't know what they were talking about, and that actually was contrary to what we were trying to teach them, and it was really a mess. So how would you say we should engage?
So, Carol, I want to frame my stories as they come from the ground. And so these are positive stories about how it's working where I live. Partnerships require some consistency. So one-shot deals just don't work. They require some relationship building. And for every time I've ever heard Michael Fullen speak, he talks about relationships, relationships, relationships. And I think that's what the students were talking about as well. So how to make that relationship work between the school and its community, and that could be a non-for-profit sector, it could be a local employer, it could be a corporation, requires some consistency around who's at the table. That's very helpful when you're trying to build a relationship. If you keep speed dating, I think that's pretty tricky. So we've been very successful. I'll just tell one story if I can. Mm-hmm. We have been, traditionally I think schools try to celebrate or honor those people who are their partners through cooperative education, breakfast, those kinds of things. We wanted to go a step further this year, and we wanted to actually build an advisory board. So we have a small advisory board. We don't meet often, and my learning in that story is that time is the only resource. So if we're going to have those meetings, they have to be pragmatic, and there has to be a reason for them, and they have to be very focused. So we've asked our advisory board, what messages do we want to give to young people? As much as I like the technology, I don't think there's anything quite so good as good old-fashioned FaceTime, which is what I think our tables are about today. So it's being respectful of that partnership and how it works. Having said that, how do you message that? We have a school of 1,800 students, and not all of them look like your student panel today. So our advisory board has agreed to do short clips that will be on our website around what do the people on our advisory board want to tell students about what they need. And likely it's the same thing you might tell them or I might tell them, but hopefully it's coming from a very different voice. I think I've talked a bit there.
No, that's good. Dan, from a CFIB perspective, you must talk to a lot of small businesses. And what are you hearing, either yourself or from them, about how well we're doing in producing job-ready students? And secondly, is there anything that you would recommend that we could be doing better working between the education sector and the private sector?
Sure. I'm in a little hot water this week over some comments about Canada's work ethic with respect to the temporary foreign worker program. So, but I do want to talk a little bit about that as one of the issues that we are hearing about from small business owners across Canada saying that they are noticing an erosion of job readiness, of skills that they need. And we're talking about some of the basics too, basic customer service skills, teamwork, work ethic and work hardening skills, like showing up at work on time, people that'll work a full week without disappearing, that won't be on their mobile phone for half their shift. These, unfortunately, are some of the things that small employers are telling us they're increasingly short of. I was really fortunate, and I noticed a seatmate from some of the buses and trains in Germany just a couple of weeks ago, learning a little bit more about their dual track system, and some of the examples there may be difficult to import to Canada, but my goodness, the degree of employer engagement into the system was huge. Lots of cultural factors, history that has allowed that to happen. But if we could get to that model where employers felt welcome to come and talk to educators, and educators had more experience more direct experience in the world of work, I think that there's some low-hanging fruit there. I'm sure large parts of it are not importable. Streaming kids at age 10, maybe a little bit of a worry for both the Canadian educators and for Canadian parents. But I think there are some examples we can borrow from.
Do you think that the relationships that Sheryl just talked about, that the small business owners would be willing to invest in?
I think there would be smaller employers, even in Germany, were less likely to be engaged in that. They may not have a small business operator is often working at their place of business alongside their employees day in, day out. So the amount of time they're able to take away from the business that can be a challenge. But I think there's a willingness. I think where these partnerships have been tried in the past, there isn't a lot of room in the Canadian education system to kind of allow that to really ferment and take hold. And I absolutely acknowledge the massive demand. We're expecting our education system to do kind of everything. And this is seemingly that sort of those preparing students for work seems to be reasonably low down that list of priorities.
So, Minister Sandals, we actually heard from the OECD, a person that was speaking to us, that really, when they compared Singapore and Canadian students, or Ontario students also, there was a difference in what he called hard work. He said, when you really boil it all down, it's less about adding onto the curriculum and it's more about the hard work of students. So, having heard that it is hard work and maybe the expectations of our students aren't as high as you might find in Singapore or other places, and couple that with what Dan just said about they can't even come to work on time, what recommendations would you have for the educational system?
Well, and I think sometimes when we look at the difference between Singapore, Shanghai, and Ontario, we sort of tend to look at the schools. But it's actually the whole community, the culture. It was interesting, CMEC, the Council of Ministers of Education in Canada, met with some of our Chinese counterparts recently, and the gentleman from Shanghai was giving some data. And the first thing that struck me was that they probably, so these were high school students, and they probably were spending about twice as much instructional time on math as you would spend in Ontario. In Ontario, you probably had a broader range of subjects, but they spent about twice the instructional time. In addition to that, they spent on average 2.5 hours a week outside of school with some sort of instructional experience, either a private tutor or some sort of a club where they were doing more math. And on top of that, the average Shanghai student spent 13.9 hours per week doing math homework. Even though, and that was every day, all year, even though the data that they had accumulated said after 11 hours a week of homework, there really isn't any point. You're not going to get that much better. So why I mention this is, yes, there's a whole lot more work goes into being good at math, but I'm not sure if I told a Canadian parent, these are my expectations of you, that I'm going to get very far with parents. So we need to figure out how to improve within the cultural expectations of our society. Is one thing. I wanted to comment on something Dan said. We have both conventional co-op programs where students can get involved. We also have something called specialist high skills majors, which go beyond the conventional co-op, where there's actually a cluster of courses that are focused on a particular area of study and where there's a lot of experiential learning. Sheryl has an amazing one at her school on construction, cluster of construction courses. And we approve those specialist high skills majors individually at the ministry, because there's a fair bit of flexibility from school to school in how they're structured. But one of the things that we require at the ministry is you have to have employers who are committed to the program over some length of time to provide the experiential learning. And in fact, what we find is that the majority of the employers are actually local businesses. They're not big corporations. So it actually is the local construction company, the local accounting firm, the local people, the local retailer, whatever it is, the local restaurant, are the people that actually are committed to doing that. So actually my plea would actually be to the corporate sector in Ontario that you give your branch managers the authority to make those commitments to be involved over time, because what Sheryl's saying about consistent involvement is absolutely true. We can't build a program for students based on experiential learning if we don't have a continuing commitment from employers to be the hosts.
So, James, turning to the corporate sector here,
Yep.
what has your experience been with, whether it's internships or however we want to call this, summer jobs? What's the practical reality of managing those? Does productivity go up when they arrive? Does productivity go down? What's your view on it?
Well, as you know, we were sitting together. So I think it's there's pros and cons. So the pros are very obvious. I mean, hiring young people, you're hiring millennials. If you're in the business of serving customers, you're hiring people that you are ultimately going to have a very long relationship with in business. So that part's all good, bright, refreshing. But anytime a company hires an employee, whether they're full-time or part-time, there's a momentary reduction in productivity because somebody has to mentor that person. Somebody has to show them the ropes a little bit, even if it's only a little bit. And so it takes effort to hire 50 summer students. It really does. But it's worth doing, but it should be recognized that it's not just, hey, corporate Canada, open your doors and let all of our students come in, because there are demands for that. But I think, further to that kind of experience, I think once you're opening your doors to employment, it's not too late, but we're starting to get too late in the cycle. So I think some of the areas that I want to push, especially on corporate Canada, is to push it a little bit further up the stream. When kids are making or want to make some decisions in grade 8 or grade 9, there's a gap. Every time I spend time with university students or high school students, except for my own kids, there is a huge thirst to understand how did you do it? What did you do? What is the job market like? What is it like? And if we can pull that up, and that's why I think it's true, you're looking for long-term partnerships, but I would push back a little bit and say corporate Canada would like to see a standardized door, an entryway into the public education system, so that we know exactly who, how, when to approach, so that we can share. So rather than allow it be a flood of these companies coming in, you open up a little box and let those that pass the test, those that are willing, those that have all the right criteria and police checks, are able to share because they want to help. And I think I think it's almost no cost, and I think the students would really suck that up, and that starts to provide what I'll call the understanding what the options are for their career, understanding that hard work is involved, because if we tell our kids that hard work isn't involved, as parents, we're failing, because it is only getting harder in Canada, and it's getting harder outside of Canada. That I know for a fact.
Rick, you've updated your paper recently.
Yes.
And, demographics have changed. People are working longer, et cetera, et cetera. Would you describe the situation compared to when you first wrote the paper as it's getting better or it's getting worse? Is the glass half empty or is the glass half full?
A little bit of each. When I did the first paper, I made a very simplistic definition of the level of education required, and that was some experience beyond high school. So whether it was apprenticeship or college or university or whatever it happened to be. I've rethought that because what we've seen is that we're increasingly getting skills mismatches, and I know there's controversy over that, but we have a supply-demand mismatch, we have geographical mismatches, we have underemployment. 25% of recent university grads are underemployed, not to consider the 15% that are unemployed, and we're also getting, which is the invisible curse of productivity, the people who are underqualified. The job has evolved beyond their capabilities, and that is not being noticed, and it's all across. I mean, whether it's not-for-profit or government or businesses or education, it's happening in all those places. So that's the worst side, and how do you help students align their careers, their future in the real time? And I think that's the real challenge. And I think there's some ways around it, but it's going to require some changes in the systems we now have.
Do you want to share some of those specifics around what we would change?
Well, let's take our current post-secondary system. We basically built a siloed system. We've said, okay, we've got universities here, and we've got colleges there, and the government, to their credit, has been trying feverishly to set up a transfer credit protocol. And when I was president at Seneca, I was arguing for that. We got to have it, we got to have it, we got to have it. I realized I was totally wrong, because what's occurring is that students are, and I'll give Seneca's example, I know it better. They're coming to Seneca for a 2-year arts degree, and then they're transferring to York or U of T to get a 4-year arts degree. And then they have a skills mismatch, right? They get their transfer credit, but it doesn't help them in the future. So we need to look at ways where we can shrink the time interval between when we force people to make a career, educationally related career decision, and when they graduate. And right now, we're telling them, you better make that decision around grade 10, right? So they're 7 years out. If you want to be an engineer, you're 7 years out. And I'll be very quick because we've got some other great people here. I give my own personal illustration, and I'm always cautious about the sample of one, whether that's the great thing to do. I did a history degree, right? I went into the military, and they put me into a 7-month aircraft maintenance course. And by the time I came out of that course, I could actually fix aircraft, right? So we ought to be looking at like 3+1 modules. You know, let's have some good university training, but that last year, and it could be in university, it could be in a college, it could be somewhere else, is really that bridge between the person's interest and the labor market. And they get that training in a very condensed, organized fashion, and it's credited for whatever credential they're trying to get.
And it's near term, so it matches.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I got my degree in sociology and English, so it worked.
Yep.
Let's move a little bit back to this, because this is really what we're trying to solve, is the private sector and the educational sector working more closely together. I think, it's been clear throughout the day that we all agree that this is a good idea. I think the real question is how and on what. And I want to get your views on, the easy answer always seems to be internships or summer jobs. That's kind of the easy thing, at least the easy answer. But we know that it's not all that simple. We're talking about a son who couldn't find an internship because he's in an area that's actually quite unique. Are there other things that you think we could do together that would help get that jump start on experience that we keep hearing from the private sector, other than internships and summer jobs? Sheryl, have you experienced some really good examples?
So of course, the traditional ones. But before we leave those, I just want to touch on another maybe a tangent around disrupting what students think, because you're talking about students making decisions really early in their secondary school career, and we already heard on our very first panel this morning how quote unquote streaming or labeling students limits that. So around the experiential domain, if you can't create that in the way that Ryan is talking about, and you can't create all of those wholesale internships, then you have to do something that creates that within a classroom context in partnership with corporate and non-for-profit organizations that message to young people the possibilities. So if that's some kind of speakers bureau, that's a bank that we can access that way, there has to be some kind of sense that those sectors are working together that disrupts young people's thinking about who they are, what they're going to become, without saying to them, what are you going to do? Mm-hmm. Because this increased pressure on 14, 15, and 16-year-olds by their teachers and by their parents and by the world, what are you going to do when you finish school, is creating inordinate stress for a whole audience here today who can't come up with the answer for our young people. So yes, we're talking about creating the experience, but I think there are ways within classrooms to create possibilities for authentic context. Give us an industry problem, give us something, give us a case study, feed us that way in ways that creative teachers can access that and present it to young people as this is project-based learning, this is a real world problem, and stop differentiating between what our students are experiencing and what you're experiencing as though they're not in the real world. Because the message we keep giving to them is, well, when you get out in the world, as though, where do you think they're living now? So their worlds are enormously complicated. So if we can't in real time create it, certainly in a world that's this technologically savvy, we could create these kinds of case study things that could be very authentic context. Because my experience with young people is that they're very engaged in issues of social justice. They're very engaged in real world issues, what's in the media, what's topical. I don't know if that really answers the question.
That's good. Dan, can you think of anything that...
One of the things that I really struggle with is also how to do that with chunks of the economy that young people may not want to go into. Jobs that have become, either
not cool.
That aren't cool. I mean, I think about, and this is, I've spent a lot of time with this issue with respect to the temporary foreign worker program, but finding somebody who is keen to clean a hotel room is increasingly difficult in Canada. Any hotel anywhere in the country will tell you that finding somebody other than a temporary foreign worker who's willing to do that is next to impossible. People who are prepared to go and work in agribusiness is also an area that is increasingly difficult. The a restaurant sector, retailer. Some of these jobs have other struggles, admittedly, wage levels, shift work, things like that. But there are lots of jobs out there that are going begging. And we do just about nothing in terms of connecting that to the school system. And I will say I saw a few glimmers of that when I was in Europe, in that the requirement was at a fairly early age for a student to actually have an employer partner as they finished their vocational training system. So they actually had to go out there and interview for a partner. And so many of these students actually did get some, and their views of trades were much broader than what we call trades in Canada. They were almost across the industry spectrum. And so there were partnerships that were developed, and kids that actually saw some opportunities in industries they might not have liked to be in. So while every second student wants to go into filmmaking or wants to become a teacher, even though we have huge unemployment for young teachers, it gave young people some exposure to jobs they may not have thought of, and perhaps the opportunities weren't as bad, or there were management tracks for them in the future in jobs that might have been viewed as uncool or jobs that they didn't want to do. And we've got a lot of jobs that need doing in Canada that aren't terribly attractive to a lot of people. Employers have their share, their role to play in that. I get it, but I think our system needs to accommodate that too.
As a moderator, I'm not supposed to do this, but you make me think of a story. Some of you probably know Linda Hasenfratz, Linamar, who are an auto parts company, very successful global company. And she, we were talking recently about skills, and she said most of her employees are immigrants, but the children of her employees do not necessarily want to be tool and die makers. So she goes into, she has these dinners for, 500, 600 high school students, and talks about, you can make over $100,000 being a tool and die maker. You need to think about it and, come and visit us. And so, I think that point about, and I used to hear it, the business school all the time, about the cool jobs and the not so cool jobs, when you really just wanted to say, just get a job and work for a great person and learn something. So I think we do need to think about how I guess that's you don't need to necessarily go to university for these jobs, and that's where the mismatch comes in. Rick?
Just a quick comment, because what the research is showing is that the kids who graduate today won't retire till they're over 70. They'll have 5 different careers, and they'll have 15 to 20 jobs. So we put all this stress on these 16, 17-year-olds to make the right decision, and we really ought to be helping them understand what the world of work is really going to be looking like, and that whatever they decide today, they're probably not going to be in it 5 years from now.
There is a view, I want to ask Minister Sandals this question. There is a view that perhaps we coddle our kids too much, if I could use that word. My own experience where parents, I couldn't believe this, would call a professor and say, I don't think my student did well enough on this. She didn't mark the paper properly. And these are, these kids are at this point 21.
Wait until you meet the ones that after they get through the professor, they call the MPP to complain their university kids didn't get high enough marks.
I can beat that. Employers are telling us the parents of the kids are coming to the employer to talk about the fact that John or Sally didn't get the promotion.
So I guess we've answered the question, these coddling parents. But is there some work to be done? I mean, I think what we all know is there's no silver bullet here. And it's not just the education system. It's not just the private sector. It's how they grow up also. We heard from the OECD person about hard work and setting expectations. But I just wondered your views and whether when you make change in the education system, you have so many stakeholders, be it students, be it parents. How do you manage that change? Let's say you wanted to make some changes.
Well, and I think you're absolutely right that when you change something, one of the things that is blowing me away is the amount of ink that has been expended on should kids have cursive writing, which is like, hello, we're discussing cursive writing. There's all these other things. I bet none of you here, when you interviewed somebody lately, checked to see what their cursive writing skills were like. But that seems to be a big, so yeah, it really is sometimes trying to pull people kicking and screaming into let's do it a little differently. And it is an inertial system. I think, though, that we do set high expectations, and we do incrementally set the expectations higher, and we do incrementally move the system along. So So, for example, when we go into our new vision, one of the things we're looking at is how do we effectively use technology, not, how do you punch in how to use Facebook or whatever, but how can we use technology to actually assist in educating kids better. And I want to talk a bit about what Rick was saying about how far out we're expecting kids to make decisions. And one of the things that we heard from students was not so much experiential learning, and they wanted that, but they also wanted to know about relevance of curriculum. And it goes back to a lot of what we've been talking about is where's the opportunity for business to talk to people? Is it the Speakers Bureau? Is it using technology to bring modules of bits of information into the classroom? But I think the opportunity for the quicker hit interplay between business, be it profit, nonprofit, big, little, is how is this piece of curriculum relevant? Because what the students wanted to know was, if I'm learning this now, and it doesn't matter whether it's history or science or math, how do you use that in the real world? You want me to know how to write coherent English. How do people use that ability to write in their day-to-day jobs? Why does it matter? So there's a lot of opportunity to talk to students about relevance and how is this piece of learning useful in the real world. And that doesn't say you have to choose a career that uses that, but what it does start to do is bring in a better understanding of where are the opportunities related to this set of learning without asking people to actually make a decision. It's just knowledge of what's out there.
Would you please join me and thank our panel? It's great.